Welcome to the program today, everybody. Mondo Gonzalez here in studio, and I have through Skype Alexis Katz, all the way from Idaho. And we're going to be talking really about a pretty amazing topic. Of course, as you all know, I love astronomy, and there's been some exciting things happening over the past few years, and something coming up here in April, which will be exciting as well. Before we go to Alexis, I want to remind everybody about our upcoming conference, June 27th. If you're interested in joining us in Colorado Springs, you can go to watchersweekend.com. You can also go to prophecywatchers.com and get all the information there as well. It's going to be a great time. Colorado is always a wonderful time to be in the summer. We're just getting done with our Orlando conference, and we know that things are happening so fast that we realize the need to keep people informed, and also for people who come to the conferences in person. We know that there's such a powerful influence as it relates to fellowshipping together. We know, again, there's not a lot of people who are watching prophecy in the church. We're sad for them, our brothers and sisters. And so getting together is a great opportunity for us to continue to encourage one another, as Hebrews 10:25 says, to fellowship and encourage one another as we see the day approaching. So we'll get back here to Alexis. Welcome, Alexis.
Thank you, Mondo, for having me. It's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Yes, and you and I, we've kind of been discussing this topic really even before you had the book finished. And I know that you have a background, and I know your husband does too. Kind of share a little bit about your love of astronomy and other things. And before we even get into the eclipses, kind of tell people about yourself and why you like what God has done in the heavens.
Well, I have to admit, I wasn't interested in astronomy so much when I was a child, but my husband introduced me to it. He was more involved in radio astronomy, and he has done some astrophotography at Kitt Peak, and he was involved in SETI and Sarah too. But when he showed me Saturn through his telescope, that was so beautiful and amazing, and it is a Christmas tree ornament without the tree, without the hooks, and it's just hanging there, and you just can't deny that that's God, and He designed the universe that way. So that started to get me interested in it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And for those right here up front, what we're going to be discussing, and kind of as a just so that people know where we're going, we're discussing the eclipse that happened in 2017, as well as the one that's coming up here in April of 2024. And so kind of before we get into the details, kind of give us a thesis of your book, because then we'll get into some of the background.
Well, I had heard that we actually live close to the 2017 eclipse. We were just outside of it at about 99%. And after I had heard that there were some Salem cities covered by the eclipse, I wanted to just research it, see if that was true. And I found so much more. It sparked my interest to stick with it and investigate all the locations covered within the path of totality for the 2017 eclipse, the annular eclipse of October 2023, and then the total solar eclipse of April 2024. And as I gathered that information, first of all, I was very skeptical. But as I moved along and saw those locations, I kind of had to throw that skepticism trophy in the trash, because as it was playing out was just extremely interesting. And when you look at it statistically, it's beyond chance.
Yeah, to me, it's amazing, because the eclipse comes across and it creates a shadow across the United States, and it does this for all eclipses. We'll talk about more of that. But then the 2024, for people listening, there's another one that starts down in Mexico and makes its way up again, and so it made this X across in the United States. But I love some of these things, like, oh, well, that's interesting that it comes across here, and then it makes another one there, and it makes this X marks the spot. Does God mean anything from this? And so what you did was, which I thought was fascinating, again, as you sent me some of the initial manuscripts, and for our audience here, is, as you mentioned, Salem. Again, I lived in Salem myself for a while, but the fact of the matter is that totality makes its way across certain very specific cities, whether it's the one coming this way or the one coming up. And so you decided, hey, you know what? Is there any significance to the specific cities that it's mentioning? And we're going to get into that later. But let's talk about from a biblical perspective right here at the front. And you did this in the book, which is excellent. Talk about what the Bible says about the sun, the moon, the stars, and the seasons, signs, etc.
Yes, well, as we see in Genesis 1:14, and God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs," and in Hebrew that's ot, "and for seasons," which is moedim, and they would be for days and years. So there you have it. They're supposed to be for signs and seasons. And often I've heard of people doing a study on the seasons, which is fantastic. That would be the fall feast, the spring feast, Yom Teruah, Shavuot, Passover. But I wanted to show that there was a distinction between signs and seasons. And for signs, in Hebrew, what that means is a flag, a beacon, a monument, omen, prodigy, evidence, mark, miracle, and promised by prophets as pledges of a certain predicted events. So it's clearly different than just seasons. So right there, that's why he put them there. And then we go on and we find that if that's the case, we have permission to look there. And when you go on and you talk about, well, Psalm 19, right? Speaking of, they pour forth speech night after night, they reveal knowledge. Well, who are they speaking to? And who's the recipient of that knowledge? Well, it's us. And then later, of course, Jesus says to watch in Luke 21, tells us to watch, and there'll be signs in sun, moon, and stars. So we get permission from him to watch. So it's clear a lot of people are afraid to look up into the heavens because as you get into astronomy versus astrology, um, Christians are afraid of that. And what's very interesting is Genesis 18. After God created the heavens, he then says he called it good. Isn't it interesting how the devil sneaks in there and turns something God called good into, he perverts it, right? So many times Christians won't look because they think they can't. And that kind of, what a sneaky thing to do, to keep us from the message that God has for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, I find it interesting, and certainly I've talked a lot about this in some of our Psalm 19 projects, in that, we look in the book of Job and other places, and God mentions the Mazzaroth, which is, today we call it the zodiac.
Right.
These 12 constellations that the sun, as the earth is moving around, and we see the sun in these specific same constellations, these 12 constellations, one per month, every time. And so, but God mentions those as his part of his design, again, in order to have these seasons and these regularities, these periodic regularities. I mean, there was, you can go out, and if the Big Dipper, you know exactly which season you are. Just go out at midnight, you can see where it's oriented, and you go, oh, I know either what season or specifically what month it is, just based on looking at the Big Dipper itself. And even you can tell the exact time if you know how to do it. I've spent some time doing it. You're like, oh, I want to practice. And so you go out and you're like, hey, I can see what time it is simply by the Big Dipper. So God puts these things in there because from the beginning of the creation, he's allowed these things. But I think what you said is right. And it's good for us to make that clarification that we know in the Old Testament and other passages, as you mentioned, even in Jesus, that eclipses and other things happened, and they were set for signs of, and we know this at the end, there'll be a lot of signs and eclipses and things. We know that when Jesus was crucified, that the sun turned dark, and that was very not natural, because you don't have the sun turning dark for 3 hours in a natural eclipse. But nevertheless, God used these things in order to speak in certain ways. And so when we think about astronomy, let's maybe start there for a second. Astronomy versus astrology. How do you define, you mentioned this in the book, which is good. How do you make a distinction between the two?
Well, originally there wasn't a distinction, but over the years it got more perverted. But it became a religion for some, worshiping the sun, moon, and stars. And then divination, I guess, got involved in that. And people believe that it has some control over you. But Astronomy is the study of the heavens. It's science. It doesn't go off into telling you that you're born on a certain day, so this is what's going to happen that day. It's not that way. Stick with the science.
Yeah, and that's again no one's looking to these to determine our future, but a very small distinction there is important in that. Again, we don't look to horoscopes and other things to determine how my day is going to go. God's in control. We know that, but
Yes.
but we also know, again, that God has used the heavens to speak, and as you mentioned, Psalm 19, and so even today, what we want to say is that, and this will be, I'll make it clear right up front, is nowhere in the book or nowhere in all of your research have you come out and said, this means this, that you're making a prediction or a prophecy.
No, no, no. No, and I want to say up front too that I'm not a prophet, and I want to make clear too, because I've seen some comments where people think, oh, here we go again. Somebody's given a day, an hour, and time for the rapture. No, that is not what I'm saying at all. I'm not saying that on April 8th, 2024, that's the day for the rapture or the second coming, or even that we're going to have an earthquake that day, and we may just go right through it with nothing happening. But it could, and things could happen before and after. So it's not predicting any day or hour, anything like that.
What I find interesting, and again, when you originally had sent me the manuscript, was there's two things. One, I was like, oh, man, this is extremely fascinating and interesting. And then you begin to say, well, what do I do with it? Well, again, that's applicable to each person. But what it did reveal to me was looking at it and pondering it, and we'll talk about that in a moment, is a paradigm thinking was God showing something here of his control, of his ability to set this in motion at the time of creation.
Exactly.
And to see it go through these very specific cities and the names of the cities. So let's talk about the paradigm for a minute.
Well, as we know with Joseph, he interpreted the Pharaoh's dream, and he told him that there would be 7 years of preparing, and they were gathering grain. They were preparing for the famine that would occur the 7 years following. I see a 7-year period, of course, between the 2017 and 2024 eclipse, and then 7 years after. To me, I see that we need to prepare. And if people want to prepare for food shortages, that's up to them. But I see it more as a preparation for eternity. And there's going to be a spiritual famine from this point on. And I think we're already seeing that. But it's a time now if you don't know Jesus Christ as your Savior, the time is now. And there's no reason to wager your eternity, but to look to him now. And so I see that we all know it's much more urgent now. And I see that paradigm here.
Yeah, to me, there's a couple things that I think are fascinating in that, when we look at the world, when I talk about the world, I'm talking like the UN or the World Economic Forum and all the globalists, the elites, etc. They're the ones that are bringing out these dates, 2030, 2028, the 50 and 5.net, that whole movement to have everybody having their digital passports and even all the small countries by 2028. To me, we're not putting these dates out, but it's interesting how the enemy who is speaking is thinking about certain dates. Now we know God's sovereign and all of it, but nevertheless, there's these very interesting things that have occurred astronomically. And I don't know what the exact meaning of it is, and you have part of it in the book, and I've done a video on this as well. In September of 2017, you had some very interesting astronomical things taking place in Leo, the constellation, and Virgo, as it relates with Jupiter. You're like, well, what does that mean? I don't know what it means, but it's interesting that it has appeared, and it happens to be the same year as the 2017. So
yes,
talk about that for a moment.
Well, I don't speak too much on the Revelation 12 sign because I'm not an expert. But what I did was put some links in there to a video that was very well done. and explaining the mechanics, the orbital mechanics, and what was going on at that time. And my husband is more familiar with astronomy in that area. And so you also had a gentleman on your show, I think his name was Sean,
Sean?
and he did yes, and he did a wonderful explanation about that, how rare that was, and that it hadn't occurred for, I think, 6,000 years. So to see that occur right at the time of the 2017 eclipse, to me, it was a sign that there's no turning back. Things aren't going to go back to the way they used to be. Things have changed, and in there it's talking about not just birth pains, but the woman is actually giving birth. Okay, the water's broken, and any father or mother knows that once that occurs, the child has to be born within 24 hours. So it's a sign that there's no turning back. That's how I saw that. So, but I recommend that if people do get the book to take a look at those videos. They are fascinating, very well done, and I could not do a better job of explaining them.
Yeah, Sean and I had talked, and we're great friends. And when we had talked about it, again, and I would ask him, kind of in a similar way to you, is that, well, are you saying it means something very specific? And he's like, no. And I said, so can we say that we don't know exactly what it means, but it is really intriguing? He goes, that's what I'm saying. He goes, this is very intriguing. There's definitely some potential connections to Revelation 12 there. It lined up. It's very historic in that it hasn't happened for 6,000 years. And so at the end of the day, I would say that most people, certainly in ancient times, they might have, if it happened in ancient times, they might have recognized, oh, what's Jupiter doing there? Hanging out for 9 months. It's pretty fascinating. But they would have probably had maybe a more prophetic or speculative answer to what it might mean. But in our day, with computer software, as you know, we get to see some of this stuff. It's pretty amazing. And then we get to document, oh, that hasn't happened in 6,000 years. So we get to see a little bit more of its special significance in that regard. So, let's talk a little bit about eclipses. Kind of give us, and we'll have some visuals up here for people, but kind of give us, the average person who might not have ever seen an eclipse, what's the difference really between a lunar eclipse and a solar eclipse, and some of the terminology here?
Well, you'll hear a lot of people saying this is no big deal because we have many eclipses taking place. And the average is about 2.35, I think it is, as far as eclipses per year. But what we need to make clear is there are different types of eclipses. There's a total solar eclipse, annular, partial. That's just the solar eclipses. And then there's lunar eclipses. And what needs to take place in order for a total solar eclipse to occur is you have the orbital plane of the Earth. Okay, that's how it makes its orbit around the sun. And then you have the orbital plane of the moon. All right, and that's not the same as the Earth. It's at 5.1 degrees tilt from that. The moon is going around the Earth, and it doesn't just go, it's kind of like a gyroscope. That's probably the best way to explain it. Now, in order for a total solar eclipse to happen, the moon has to come right in front of the Earth, in between the Earth and the sun, and that's called the node as it crosses over the orbital plane. And then if it crosses over the node on the other side, the moon is back there, then you're going to have a lunar eclipse. Once that takes place, you also have the Earth on its axis spinning around. So when you have a total solar eclipse, you have what is called the umbral shadow. So it's like a laser, kind of a dark laser onto the Earth. Most of the time, it goes over the ocean, and it doesn't make land. So if you've got the Earth spinning around like that, for it just to hit the United States and cross over in that angle is pretty rare. And then to have another one only 7 years later, crossover in that direction. Again, it all had to line up. And the sun is 400 times larger than the moon, and yet it's also 400 times distant. I mean, God created that so that we could view these signs and eclipses just from planet Earth.
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, when we look back and we see, going back to Genesis chapter 1, 14 through 16, that God made the sizes and put them at exactly the spot where you could even have an eclipse. I mean, any little movement out, as we know, out again, we just had an annular eclipse, which means that the sun was, or that the moon was not in the right distance, and so it still allowed you to see the external part of the sun, and so the moon was a little farther out than it needed to be. But so we have these things, and God made it that way in order to bring them about. And so that to me is the fascinating part of all this. Is again, just if anything, what we would say is God is saying, okay, everybody, wake up, pay attention. Right. Now, I'm not saying, and I don't think you are either, that we're gonna predict today exactly what God means by it, except to take notice. And it's not, there's no doubt if we look at the last 7 years, no doubt a lot has happened in 7 years. And I think really when we come to 2020 and what we saw in the global world, that is the turning point for what we're now watching, as we're going to maybe see over the next period of time for approaching the end of the age. I mean, we're seeing a lot of things happen, and I think, as you said, 2020 really became a point of no return in many ways, especially for those that are the globalists, the elite, the New World Order people, and they are not giving up. They have every desire to continue to maintain control, and whether we see it with, in the digitization age, the World Health Organization, passports, control, diseases, all the other things, the biomedical stuff. So here we are, and just add this to the list of things which I think are fascinating. So let's talk about a little bit more in detail. You mentioned it earlier, but talk about the discovery aspect of what you did here.
When I decided to take a look and see if there were the Salems, let's get some over here. Salems, one of the first, I should say, locations that I found that seemed to have prophetic significance was a city called Donald. And that was at the very beginning. If you look at the pathway of the 2017 eclipse, I saw Donald there, and there's Salem, and there's a few other things. But I thought, okay, well, here we have Donald. Are there other cities throughout the United States named Donald? Well, no, I didn't find any. There's another one called Donald's, and that's towards the end of the 2017 eclipse. Well, but the very beginning.
Let me just say this. I mean, when I first got your manuscript, my sister lives in Donald, so I know Donald. I grew up about 5 miles from it. So, Donald, Oregon, it's there, it's real. There. But as you said, it's unique. And so, so go on. I'm sorry, just interrupt. I know Donald.
That's wonderful to hear. But then, so you have it at the beginning of the 2017 eclipse. And what occurred at the beginning of 2017? Well, Donald Trump became the president. And it doesn't matter whether you like him or dislike him. That's the fact. And, right next to that, if you pull out, you can see very close to it is St. Paul. All right. And I have family members who did not like Trump at all, and I have family members who did like him. But the one who did not said, well, if God can use Paul, I mean, he was a pretty bad guy, then he can use anyone he wants. Well, okay, I looked at that and went, all right, this is interesting, but I was still skeptical, and is this a coincidence? And then moved on and found many other locations, and just one other I will mention was McCain Guard. And right about that time was when Senator McCain had passed away. And so he had gone on and going through these. And what I do want to say is there are 117 locations that I logged just in the 2017 eclipse, and there are 8 maps provided with all the coordinates so people can confirm whether those locations are actually within the path of totality. I stay within the umbral shadow so that when people are in that and they look up, they're going to see 100% coverage of the sun. I don't go outside that. That's the penumbra, and people out there will see percentages of the eclipse.
Yeah, so just so people understand, is the shadow started in the west.
Right, in Oregon.
In Oregon, and that shadow of the eclipse went across the United States. And so what you're doing is you're going and saying, oh, which cities in order did it cross? And so you're looking at all these cities, and you're looking really at the names and the meanings of these names, correct?
Yes. And so then as I proceeded, and there are many more names in there, but we just can't get into all of them now. But when we got to the crossover point, I had heard that Carbondale everyone's saying, okay, Carbondale's in the crossover point. Well, yes, it is, but it's mentioned because it's the largest city nearby, and its population is the largest. But I wanted to dig in a little bit more, really zooming in. And what I found within the crosshairs, again, that's the very center of the shadow, the umbral shadow, the crosshairs of the 2017 eclipse and the 2024 eclipse. And I found Makanda and Makanda, Illinois. That's the spot that the crossover took place. So I thought, well, what does Makanda mean? I needed to look up the meaning of that name. And it turns out that Makanda in African origin means woman of strength, and in Sanskrit, it also means woman of power. And it just so happens that Kamala Harris became the Vice President of the United States at that time, about halfway through between 2017 and 2024. And she, not only is she the second African American woman and first South Asian American senator in history, but here she is. The powerful woman. So I thought, oh boy, okay, well, let's take a look. What else occurs in Makanda? And I found that they have the annual Black Vulture Festival that takes place there. And where have we heard of vultures? When the Lord was speaking of the end times, I like this particular translation, but it says in Matthew 24:28, wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. So to me, just my opinion, but I see our nation. Is it becoming a carcass? I mean, have we just turned away from the Lord? I do see our nation as somewhat of a carcass, and the vultures are circling above, waiting to swoop down. And we can see that with impending war. Again, I'm not saying any dates, but it was just very interesting. And then you go on and you find out that what is also located there is Giant City State Park. Giant City State Park. Okay, that's right in the crosshairs. Where have we heard of giants? Well, when you talk about the days of Noah, when Jesus was talking about that in Matthew, he said, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the coming of the Son of Man. And so we look back in the days of Noah, and what occurred then? It wasn't just fancy weddings. And if people want to find out more about that, they can check with L.A. Marzulli. But the fallen angels came down and had relations with women, and they had the giants. So there's the connection, as it was in the days of Noah, and we're talking about the end times. Then after you go from Giant City State Park, actually you go in there, and there's a unique geologic formation, and it's called the Devil's Stand Table. So the more that I went into this, the stranger it became, if that's a word, the more strange it became. And so here you have the Devil's Stand Table, and many folks in the past named it the Devil's Stand Table because they saw it as a like the Devil's Pulpit. And that's approximately 75 feet above the surrounding terrain. So I asked myself, well, has America become the Devil's Stand Table? Well, I leave that up to everybody's interpretation, but we certainly have not been sticking with what God wants in this country. We've become pretty degraded, and I see that we had a warning in 9/11. And there's Ninevehs in here too. So when you apply it to that, Nineveh repented, so God spared them. But 100 years later, they were destroyed because they fell back into that. After 9/11, you may see, people went back to church for a couple of weeks, months, or whatever, but we really didn't repent as a nation. In fact, we've gotten far worse, and in only, 20-something years, right? So there's that connection too. Now, the 2024 eclipse, it's going to cross exactly over that point again. So there's that doubling. When Joseph was in speaking to Pharaoh, he said there was a doubling in Pharaoh's dream. And when there's a doubling, that means that God is going to bring it about soon, and he means what he says. So
yeah, I think about all the things that have happened since the first eclipse in 2017 and how far America has gone down in that 7 years. And, again, there was a warning there if we just take it for whatever in general. I mean, the world is put on notice already. To think in terms of 7 years from April another 7 years of decline and decadence, and the going even further past the point of no return is actually very concerning. I wouldn't call it scary because I trust the Lord, but nevertheless, in some ways, for the average unbeliever who doesn't have the same level of hope and confidence that we do, it should be very scary for them, because if the decline of our culture can happen so fast, especially when we think about the current, administration and the ways in which they're seeking to destroy our country in so many ways, it's just sad. But another thing that struck me is if we look at the 2024 eclipse, that it starts down in Mexico, it comes through up into the United States through Texas and Arkansas and all the way through, and as you mentioned, in Illinois. Let's talk about where it exits. Now, this, I'm blown away. I didn't even know some of these cities existed. But talk about the exit points, some of the major cities as it exits the continental United States.
Well, in the 2024 eclipse, there are 12 states that the eclipse crosses, technically 15, but they're just little tips. And I've logged 252 locations within the path of totality in the 2024 eclipse. And it's full of information. But where it exits is, just as it goes out, is actually Magog, Moscow, Orient, and Burnt Church. I didn't make it up. I did not make it up. But, there it is. And there are plenty of other locations there. In 2024, there's Ozon. Ozon means global payment system. Right there. And you have others, North Salem, Advanced Lebanon. Damascus is right near Gravesville. Okay, well, again, there's so many that you can look at. And I thought, well, hey, if I take my finger and cross it over the United States, can I create a story here? What locations are there? Doesn't even come close. So if anyone's thinking that, you can do that anytime. And the point is, it didn't happen that way. The sun and the moon don't obey me or anyone else. They obey God. And as you said, he set this into place when during creation for such a time as this. So here you have it.
No, to me, again, especially in our world, we talk often about, the Gog-Magog war. And what city is Magog in, or what state?
Vermont.
And Moscow's in Vermont too?
Maine.
Okay. So
Orient is also in Maine.
And then Burnt Church.
Right there.
Burnt Church is where?
New Brunswick. So it just goes off at New Brunswick. So, it's the continent. If you don't want to count it, that's fine. There's plenty in here to get your attention.
It's just, to me, it's fascinating when we think about, again, I didn't even know there was a Magog city in all of America, but to have Magog and Moscow so close. I know there's a Moscow, Idaho. I've been there before. But to have it right there, and then where it leaves the North American continent, Burnt Church. Again, no one's here saying what it means.
No,
but
it's just data. You called it undeniable data.
Yep.
And the coordinates are provided for hundreds of the locations that are within the path of totality. And I wanted to stay within that path because it very clearly, to me, is just God's kind of Sharpie going across the United States.
Yeah. Well, any final thoughts or things that you want? I mean, you have a book out. We carry it in our bookstore. We want to recommend anybody, if they want to be blown away again by the data, the undeniable data, this book will do that. Any final thoughts about what you want the reader to walk away with?
Well, most of all, to know that God is in control. He always has been. He always will be. By taking a look at this, you realize that he knew the past, he knows the present, and he knows the future. So if he's telling us in his word what is going to take place, then we need to look to him and trust him. And Jesus is throughout all of history, has the most impeccable integrity. When he tells us that he's coming back and that he is who he claims to be, and that we need to believe in him. This proves that God knows what he's doing. The word is true, and we need to turn to him and seek his guidance and believe in everything that he says. It's the Bible is what we have to go to. But this points you to it. Everything that's in here is what's in Daniel and in the book of Revelation, no exact time. But I think people will find it fascinating. Everything's provided. I've done the work for them with, for 177 locations in the path of 2017, 43 in October, and the 252 locations for 2024 with all the maps provided, all the coordinates provided, and then there's plenty of scripture in there too, and many other things that we just don't have the time to get into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I appreciate your time today, Alexis. And again, for those watching, we are living in exciting times, and here we are. We're going to be we're going to be documenting the 2024 eclipse, and it'll be interesting to see over the next whoever knows how long what will happen, and will anything we think about, again, Magog or Moscow or other things. We know certainly there's a war going on right now, but these are the fascinating things that God gives us to ponder and to meditate on. And ultimately, he gives all things. Whether we understand the full significance and whether we're unable to assign an exact meaning is irrelevant. The fact of the matter is the warnings are there, and God is always seeking to use anything and everything to draw us back to himself. So I appreciate you watching today. Again, go to prophecywatchers.com. You can get Alexis' book. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.